In this video, we are talking about 10 players that you must start in week 13 of fantasy football. But before we get into it, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you do end up enjoying. Starting at number 10, Darnell Mooney had a down performance in week 11, but that was mainly due to him working through that Achilles injury and the blowout nature of the game against Denver, as he only ran 60% of the routes compared to his 94% route participation that he has on the year. Nonetheless, we know Darnell has been a really good fantasy option for most of the year, as he's the wide receiver 25 in fantasy points per game, while ranking 7th in deep targets along with a 29% first read share. Kirk Cousins has been looking for Darnell early and often this entire season and has the perfect opportunity to get back on track against the Chargers, who have allowed the second most yards and most touchdowns to the wide receiver position since week 8. I think this is probably going to be a high scoring game, two really good offenses going at it. So I want as many pieces of this matchup as I possibly can get. And I think Darnell has a really strong performance in week 13. At number 9, Chuba Hubbard came through for you last week. Hopefully you started him in a tougher matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, scoring 15 fantasy points, and has now scored double-digit fantasy points in all but 2 games this season. He has been phenomenal. He has been a pleasant surprise. I don't think anyone this offseason saw this coming. Hubbard has been an absolute workhorse for the Panthers. We know Jonathan Brooks finally returned last week, the rookie running back coming off that ACL. Didn't see much work at all. Didn't really matter. The Panthers paid Chuba to be the guy, and I don't really see Brooks doing much this year, so that's good news for Hubbard. And he, like I said, he's been phenomenal, ranking 7th in weighted opportunities, 8th in snap share, 9th in red zone touches, and is the RB14 in fantasy, averaging 16 fantasy points per game. Chuba also ranks 10th in explosive run rate and yards after contact per attempt. He's been really good and gets a much easier matchup against the Bucs, who have allowed the 12th most rushing yards per game to the position since week 7. So I think Hubbard continues to stay hot and needs to be locked into your RB1 spot in week 13. At number 8, T. Higgins went crazy in his first game back from injury in week 11. 9 receptions, 148 yards, touchdown, 29.8 fantasy points. When T has been on the field this year, he has been absolutely dominant. Wide receiver 6 in fantasy points per game. That's really good, along with a 26.5% target share, 38% first read share, and has earned 9 red zone targets over his 6 games played this year. Now with an AFC North showdown on tap against the Steelers, potentially Joey Porter Jr., the stud corner for Pittsburgh, could be shadowing Jamar Chase. He could be shadowing T. Higgins. We don't really know. My bet is that Porter will be on Chase more than he is on Higgins. Either way, I'm expecting another massive performance from the talented receiver in week 13, as the Steelers have allowed the 13th most PPR points per target to perimeter receivers so far this year. Joe Burrow is scorching hot. This offense as a whole has been phenomenal. I expect Higgins to keep it rolling as long as he stays on the football field. At number 7, Bucky Irving made the start list last week, and boy, did he come through for us. 27 fantasy points. Irving is playing out of his mind right now. I've listed this guy as a fantasy league winner for weeks now. He's looking like one of the better running backs in football, and he's only a rookie. He's the RB12 in fantasy points per game since week 7 and ranks 3rd in yards after contact per attempt, 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, 4th in explosive run rate. And what's even more notable is Bucky is doing a lot of good things in the receiving game. Last week, 6 receptions for 64 yards, running 20 routes to Rachaad White's 11. That is very notable, along with out-targeting him 6-1. So that's always been the last kind of thing that Irving has had a breakthrough to be a superstar in fantasy, is work in the receiving game, because we know Rachaad White is solid in the receiving game. So this is crazy at this point. Like, if Irving is going to take over all the rush attempts and pass down work, he is going to be incredible down the stretch. If you have him on your team, kudos to you, because he's going to continue to help win you matchups every single week. And I'll admit, this is an easy call this week for another blow-up spot against the lowly Carolina Panthers, who have allowed the 2nd most rushing yards, most rushing touchdowns, and most fantasy points per game to running backs. So Irving is going to get it done once again and probably put up 20 to 30 fantasy points. At number 6, George Pickens is coming off his worst fantasy day since week 6, but saw the second most air yards at 143 yards last week. And obviously the snowstorm, especially in the second half, kind of limited the passing game, so that really didn't help. But that being said, George has been cooking since Russell Wilson took over as the quarterback 1 in week 7, as Pickens is the wide receiver 11, averaging 15.9 fantasy points per game, along with a 30% target share. With Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati offense cooking right now, we just talked about it with T. Higgins, this could be a high-scoring affair. And when Pittsburgh needs to throw the ball, we know that they're looking for Pickens, who is the clear-cut number 1 target in this offense. And the matchup is favorable against Cincinnati, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers since week 9. I think Pickens is going to have a banner day this week. He's been kind of up and down, a little bit disappointing, but expect him to go crazy for your fantasy team in week 13. At number 5, CJ Stroud has been a massive disappointment this year and has not come close to paying off at his ADP, but he hasn't been getting a lot of help either. This offensive line has been terrible. Stephon Diggs out for the year. Nico Collins missed 5 games with that hamstring. He hasn't had a lot of help, and he's been pressured at a rate of 41%, which is the second highest mark in the NFL. That speaks to how bad this offensive line has been. But CJ is coming off his best game since week 6, as he racked up 17.7 fantasy points, 2 passing touchdowns. Nothing crazy. It's not like he threw up 25, 30 points. It kind of shows how mediocre he has been this year. But there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic against Jacksonville, who generate pressure at the 4th lowest rate and have allowed the 2nd most passing yards, 2nd most passing touchdowns, and most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So I know it hasn't been great. It's been rocky. But if he's on your roster, I would be starting him with confidence this week. At number 4, Brian Thomas Jr. has been very limited these last couple of weeks with no Trevor Lawrence. Mac Jones has been serviceable, but nothing special, which we figured. But it's looking like T-Law is going to be back this week. Thomas did put together a solid performance before Jacksonville's bye against the Lions. 5 receptions, 82 yards, 13.6 fantasy points, and has scored 20-plus fantasy points in 3 games this season, along with 5 games of 80-plus receiving yards. And Thomas did shred this Houston Texans secondary in week 4 and looks primed to do it again, as the Texans have allowed the 4th most yards and most touchdowns to receivers since week 8. I'd expect that Jacksonville is probably going to be playing from behind in this one, so they're going to be throwing early and often. We know they don't have a ton of weapons in the pass game outside of Brian Thomas Jr. Yes, they have Evan Ingram, no Christian Kirk, but I'd expect the rookie to get hot again with Trevor Lawrence back under center. At number 3, this is more of a sneaky start, a flex option for you guys, and it's Jaylen Warren for me. I think he is really flying under the radar, and he's starting to heat up as he put together his best fantasy day of the season in the snow against Cleveland last week. 14 touches, 64 total yards, found the end zone, 15.4 fantasy points. He saw a season-high 57% snap share, outsnapping Najee Harris 38-27, and he's finally started to look fully healthy. That's something that he hasn't really been all year. He's been banged up for most of the season. These last couple of weeks, he's really started to feel like he is fully healthy. Since week 8, he ranked 7th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 8th in explosive run rate, 12th in yards after contact per attempt. That's the running back. That's the player that we know Warren is. We saw this all of last year. He was very efficient, very explosive. He's one of the better running backs, I think, in football. He doesn't get enough credit for what he does on the field. And I think he could string together another strong performance this week against Cincinnati, who have allowed the 8th highest yards after contact per attempt since week 7. It will be interesting to see if this backfield kind of continues to move more into Warren's favor, or if it's a 50-50 split, or if Najee kind of takes over again. But I'm betting that Jaylen carves out a significant role on this offense and has another big day for the Steelers. At number 2, Calvin Ridley has really started to come on over the last month or so. Since week 8, he's the wide receiver 8 in fantasy, averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game, along with racking up 451 receiving yards, which is the third most among receivers. And in 3 games with Will Levis back, 26% target share, 52% air yard share, 33% first read share. He's getting all the looks. He's the entire passing offense for the Titans. We know Levis is just going to chuck it up. He's going to give Calvin an opportunity, which is what we like from a fantasy perspective. The Commanders play man coverage at the 6th highest rate. That's good news for Ridley, who has a 2.84 yards per route run average again. So I think he's going to cook the Commanders in Week 13, who still don't have Marshawn Lattimore. He's still dealing with that hamstring injury. And yeah, Washington, the secondary, stopping the pass, they have been better as of late, but I just don't think it's going to matter. I think Calvin has a big blow-up performance as the number 1 target in this passing game. The Titans are probably going to be trailing early and often, so expect Calvin to go off for your fantasy team this week. Put him in your flex. Put him in one of your wide receiver spots. He's going to have a big day. And at number 1, Davante Adams has been pretty underwhelming since joining the Jets. Wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game, 25% target share. But to be fair, we know the entire Jets offense has been a mess. But they were on bye last week. A bye week can do wonders for a team, especially for Aaron Rodgers, who's been banged up for most of the year, hasn't really looked like himself as of late. I'm expecting the legendary duo to get back on track in Week 13, especially if Rodgers is finally fully healthy. The Seahawks have given up big games to Juwan Jennings, Demarcus Robinson, Keon Coleman in the last couple of weeks, and have allowed at least 16 fantasy points to 11 different receivers since Week 4. I think Davante should be able to pick apart the Seattle secondary with ease in Week 13. This is another game where the Jets could be chasing points against the Seattle offense, who's been playing at a pretty high level so far. So Davante, he's been underwhelming. He hasn't been great, but I do think he gets on track in this one. Coming off a bye, this offense has a chance to breathe. Rodgers has a chance to get healthy. They can regroup. I would not be betting against a future Hall of Fame wide receiver and quarterback. Adams, I think, goes absolutely bonkers in Week 13, and I don't think anyone sees it coming. That's all I have for you guys today. I do want you to do me one favor, though. Check out the link in the description. It's to play Underdog. You can sign up. If you deposit $100, they will match that, so you'll get essentially $100 for free. It's a really fun way to make Sundays more enjoyable. It's really easy. It's really simple. You can win money. If you use my code ROC, they will match your deposit. So if you put down $10, you'll get $10 back. It's pretty simple, and I've really enjoyed playing this year. Like I said, it makes Sundays a little more interesting, especially if your fantasy team is having a bad day. It's something else you can look forward to, you can watch. So sign up for Underdog today. Use my code ROC. They will match your deposit up to $100. I really appreciate you guys. If you enjoyed the video, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out more than you know, and I will see you in the next one.